Today, our country of focus is the Central African Republic, where armed men recently attacked a mine in the country, resulting in the deaths of 9 Chinese nationals. Who is behind the killings and why? What will be the consequences if there are to be any? We have the details for you in this package.
At least 9 mine workers were killed as attackers laid siege on the Chinese mining site in the Central African Republic. The site, run by the Gold Coast Group, also saw 2 of its workers wounded. The Central African Republic has been dealing with civil conflict for nearly a decade, with such killings making the headlines regularly. The CAR has suggested to keep its security tight and in good shape, and the latest attacks suggest current difficulties for the country. Chinese President Xi Jinping has called for the perpetration of the killers as the most suspected group, the Coalition of Patriots for Change (CPC), an alliance of rebel groups in the country, has denied involvement. Russia's Wagner Group has been a regular in the country on the commands of President Faustin Touadera, and the rebel organization CPC, which labeled the killings barbaric, has accused Russia of a hand in the incident. At a time when Russia and Chinese presence is growing in Africa, the question making the rounds now is who killed the 9 Chinese mine workers?
Now, joining me tonight and secure the continent for a better understanding and analysis of these issues, I have John Lechner, freelance journalist and researcher, reporting from the Central African Republic. He joins us live from Washington, D.C. I also have Professor Lauren Johnston, a senior researcher, China, Africa, at the South African Institute of International Affairs. A warm welcome to you both, and thank you for joining me on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Now, I'd like to start with Professor Johnston. What is the latest information on the attack on the Chinese mine in the Central African Republic, and how is the situation developing? Can you kindly unmute your device? Yeah. Okay, great.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead, please.
I focus on the China side of the story.
Yes.
And so I've been reading the Chinese news, which has mostly told an official story so far, because what the details of who is responsible and why it happened now is not yet known. What is known is that on March 13th, the Chinese embassy had already issued a warning to all Chinese in Central African Republic that the dry season is a high-risk season. There's often more attacks. And only just a few days before, some Chinese had been kidnapped near the border of Cameroon. So there was already a sense of high alert. As I understand it, so far the Chinese ambassador has accompanied the bodies to a hospital in Bangui, and there hasn't been any attributions officially named or made. There's been no sense of who is responsible. There's been a greater focus on emphasizing that Chinese nationals should evacuate from outside of the capital, and if they must be anywhere in Central African Republic outside of the capital, they must take incredible precautions and give the Chinese embassy all of their details. So I think that's from the China.
Staying with you in China, has there been any response from senior Chinese leadership, like as the president said anything about doing something about this attack, or any communication from the highest level of government?
Yes, there has been a call. I mean, Xi Jinping has himself called for severe punishment of those responsible for what has been described as a vicious attack. So vicious has been the word used, to emphasize what the attack was. The number of 9 Chinese killed is a very large incident for Chinese workers. So obviously the Chinese want whoever is responsible to be held to account. But so far, they have not suggested who they believe might be responsible or not. They haven't made any official attributions. They've more taken precautions.
Thank you for clearing the air on that, Professor Johnston. Now, John, the attack came just days after gunmen kidnapped 3 Chinese nationals in the country's west near the border with Cameroon. Why are the Chinese suddenly becoming a target in the Central African Republic, or is it just a random attack on minors and not necessarily a target on Chinese nationals in the CAR?
Well, that's a great question. I think we have seen safety issues for Chinese nationals operating in the Central African Republic before. I mean, these are often small entrepreneurial companies that are going off into a very fluid area with a lot of armed groups, and so they're taking on a lot of risk, and they have to manage that risk accordingly. That said, to my knowledge, there hasn't been a kidnapping in at least a couple of years of Chinese nationals working on a mine like we saw a few days ago in the West. And certainly the incident that occurred with the death of 9 Chinese workers in the center of the country is something that we've not seen before at all. And so this is fairly outside of the bounds of kind of regular patterns that we've seen in the conflict. That being said, in terms of looking for kind of potential motives, I think it's been clear more recently that the armed groups have been short on cash. And as we're kind of coming to the end of this dry season, potentially looking for more opportunities to make money, which is a potential motive for the kidnapping. And potentially we can discuss later the different options of what potentially may have happened on March 19th. But in general, it's not a pattern that we've seen, although we do know that armed groups have been low on cash, low on equipment, and potentially may have just recently been seeing Chinese nationals as a potential lucrative opportunity.
Yeah, but killing them is a bit extreme. I mean, we've often heard about kidnapping, but the death of 9 foreign workers is quite a lot. Now, as the host government, the central government in Bangui, have they said anything? What's the reaction to this attack?
Oh, I think this has been shocking for pretty much everyone in the country, and you've seen such a quick reaction from all sides, from the CPC, from the government itself. The government also looked to bring kind of people out in a show of support for the Chinese community as well. And so it's something that is being taken extremely seriously because the government in Bangui does value very much its partnership with China. And so I think we can expect certainly a more serious inquiry into what happened, because as our other guest has said, this is very far out of the norm, and the death of 9 Chinese citizens is it's on a very different level than things that we've seen before.
Okay. Professor Lauren Johnston, we've seen China's Belt and Road Initiative, and it's established businesses in different parts of the world, especially Africa, developing business interest and, expanding its influence. Now, how does the Chinese government view its investments and interest in the Central African Republic? And what implications might these attacks have for the future involvement in the country?
It's interesting, these attacks have happened in the week of the 10th anniversary of the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative. So 10 years ago this week, President Xi gave the initial Belt and Road launch speech in Kazakhstan, in Astana. And the original speech, unlike the second speech in Indonesia, had really an intensive security focus. It was a lot about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It was a lot about countering terrorism. And very recently, China has launched this global security initiative, which obviously has bigger efforts around it, bigger country-to-country peace discussions. But it also does involve security in terms of investments, and that, private entrepreneurs can invest in gold mines and so on, and do that with a sense of safety and security. So it does happen just after Xi has begun his third term and the new ministers and leaders are sworn in. And it's a very big attack. It's 9 Chinese citizens plus 2 more wounded. The Central African Republic itself is not one of China's major trading partners in Africa. It's a relatively small trade partner. It's not like Angola or, South Sudan or South Africa or Nigeria. It doesn't have yet quite the same amount of, for example, Chinese railways or what's on. So it's not Ethiopia, which is a hub for labor-intensive investments. So I wouldn't say the Central African Republic is, if 9 Chinese nationals, if 9 Chinese nationals are killed anyway, that's an enormous and tragic occurrence. Central African Republic might now even just become somewhere known in the Chinese public mind. Perhaps most Chinese didn't know much about Central African Republic at all. Now they will. And so that may just draw attention to the importance of all the risk of, I guess China will want to make sure there is a very strict response, because they are encouraging Chinese entrepreneurs to go to frontier markets and to foster these new ties. And they don't want an attack like this to disincentivize people to go and invest in frontier markets. So there will definitely be a strong cooperation and a lot of resources put into finding out exactly what happened and who is responsible. And perhaps that Central African Republic isn't a key economic partner won't change that. I think it's the 9 nationals that will determine that.
I absolutely agree with you. And there will be people in China that also want a response. And China, seeing itself as a global player, would not want its citizens to be taken advantage of. You can't just go anywhere and start killing Chinese citizens at random without some form of consequence. Professor Johnston, stay with you. I want you to speak more on China's global security initiative. What are the details of it? And would it at any point involve having Chinese boots on the ground to protect their billion-dollar investments in different parts of the world? What sort of initiative is it?
I think it's an open-ended initiative. I don't think it's designed explicitly, even to have Chinese involvement on a military level. It can be Chinese support for like the peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It can include China's new peacemaker or regional discussion for the Horn of Africa. In terms of boots on the ground, China already has been contributed. It's been a major contributor to UN peace and stability efforts in Africa for a very long time. So there are a number of Chinese military personnel who have a lot of experience in South Sudan and elsewhere already. And now China has a military port in Djibouti. That was its first overseas military port, alongside several other countries that have a military base there too. They don't have a military base anywhere else in Africa or elsewhere so far. Are they looking for one? Possibly. Do they want boots on the ground? I don't think strictly they want boots on the ground. I think that if the global security initiative worked perfectly, there would be no need for Chinese boots on the ground. So I think that's the optimal arrangement. Will they contribute to UN peacekeeping? Absolutely, they will continue to do that. Would they put Chinese boots on the ground? Possibly, if there was a bilateral agreement that would be so. Would they send Chinese troops against countries? Well, like I can't see the circumstances under which that would happen.
Without an invitation from a host country.
Yes, that one I can't see that, but I mean nothing can be ruled out. But there's not a recent precedent for that, and especially not in Africa.
Okay.
So I don't think that is the intent, but just a bigger security dialogue, and also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's really the initial focus.
Okay. Now, John, back to this attack on the 9 Chinese workers that were killed in the Central African Republic. There was no immediate claim of responsibility for Sunday's attack, but suspicion fell on the Coalition of Patriots for Change, CPC, who claimed, they came out and condemned, this group came out and condemned the attack, and they claimed without providing evidence that the Wagner group was responsible for the attacks. How do you respond to this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as Professor Johnston has mentioned, it's worth mentioning again at first that I think the folks who are following this seriously do not know yet who perpetrated this attack, and the investigation is still ongoing. And so once we start kind of going into who it could be, we're getting into kind of very circumstantial evidence and not actual evidence. So just kind of saying that first.
Okay.
That being said, as you mentioned, yes, they initially, when the reports came out about the attack, the fingers were initially pointed at the CPC in the morning on March 19th, and the attack took place, I believe, around 5 a.m. on March 19th. The CPC came out later with a press statement later that day, as you said, accusing Wagner Group and 2 colonels specifically who lead what we would call a kind of a paramilitary organization that works with Russian private military companies in KAR, which is made up of ex-combatants. The armed group, more specifically, that operates under the CPC umbrella in the Bambari region is the UPC, which is led by Ali Darasa. It operates in that area, and actually the ex-combatants who often work with Wagner Group are often ex-armed group members of the UPC as well. So the CPC came out with a statement essentially blaming 2 colonels of the ex-armed group faction, the paramilitaries, for carrying out the attack. And I believe they even mentioned a specific motive behind it, that they were paid about $50,000. The timing of that is obviously a bit strange, given that they were able to carry out their own investigation with a level of detail that most of us certainly don't have access to. But like I said, the CPC also stands accused as well. In terms of looking at some of the other circumstantial evidence, people on the ground around Bambari had placed members of the CPC around the Shimbolo, which is where the mine is located, about 25 kilometers outside of Bambari, had placed armed members of the CPC in that area for a couple of days prior to that attack. And there were rumors beforehand of armed men looking for Chinese. Whether or not those were rumors that kind of came about, like you said earlier, from the declaration of the Chinese embassy and the kidnapping, we don't know for sure, but we know that those rumors were about. And so that is kind of the extent of the facts that we have on the ground at the moment.
But can you quickly, staying on the Central African Republic, can you quickly tell us about the history of violence and conflict in the Central African Republic in the last few years and how it has affected the country's economy and political stability? Because countries are always asking for foreign investment, and you have a situation where China is investing in Central African Republic, and you have 9 of its citizens killed in the most gory manner. So where did all this violence start from, and what's the current situation?
Sure. I mean, we could dedicate an entire episode to the conflict over the past 10 years, but I think most importantly would be around in 2013, an alliance of mostly Muslim armed group members from the north of the country came down south and overturned the government in Bangui, which at that time was led by Francois Bozize. Bozize was ousted, but he tapped into and instrumentalized religious identities to mobilize different self-defense groups to form what became known as the Anti-Balaka to fight the alliance of Muslim armed groups, which was Seleka, which is Sango for alliance. That essentially created a vicious cycle of violence as the country descended into civil war, and to very much the Central African Republic is still trying to emerge from that violence. The various armed groups that made up Seleka and the Anti-Balaka began to form their own alliances that often crossed the religious divides. By around 2018 or so, a new government had emerged under Touadéra, who was a former minister under Bozize. But the government controlled very little territory outside of Bangui, while armed groups and their very fluid alliances controlled outside of Bangui, where all of the natural resources, the gold mines and the diamond mines are. As new elections came in 2020, Francois Bozize was back in the country and decided that he was going to run for president again. The Constitutional Court ruled that he could not run, as he was there was a warrant for charges of war crimes, essentially, during the 2013 period. And Bozize he grouped together with 6 armed groups, 2 anti-Balaka groups, the UPC as well, which we had mentioned, and the MPC FPRC, and 3R, which is another group in the north west of the country. They grouped together to form the CPC, which then descended on Bangui during the elections in December 2020 and January 2021. By that time, Russian PMCs were already in Bangui. They were hired by the government essentially to
protect.
To train the Central African Armed Forces on the use of the weapons which the UN had approved to send to Bangui to fight vis-a-vis the armed groups. The Russian PMCs, as well as Rwanda and the UN peacekeeping force MINUSCA, pushed back the CPC from the steps of Bangui, starting around January 13th, 2021. And since then, armed groups have largely been on the back foot as Central African forces, backed by Rwanda and Russian private military companies, have retaken many of the major towns in the Central African Republic, though it's important to note that while towns kind of remain under control, outside of towns, roads are still very insecure. And there's not just, armed groups with names. There's hundreds, if not more, different smaller groups of armed groups, bandits, and other kind of armed men going around basically stealing, robbing, and committing other crimes in addition to the armed groups which are operating. And in this dry season, we've seen a step up in attacks on both Central African Armed Forces and the Russians as well. And this recent attack is against the Chinese mines, and we don't know yet if it's the CPC or not, has occurred in a recent few weeks where we've seen a big uptick in armed group activity in the center and northeast of the country, which includes Bambari.
Thank you, John. Central African Republic is still quite volatile when it comes to security, and quite a lot of work to be done there. Now, Professor Johnston, I'm not sure if there's a precedent for this. Chinese workers attacked abroad and the response for Beijing. But typically, will there be a time frame for a response? And what do you think the Chinese diplomats in Beijing and Bangui will be doing now? What sort of investigation or what sort of action do we expect?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've been following China-Africa relations from mostly an economics lens for about 20 years, and I don't recall anything close to this. And, so there was the evacuation of Chinese in Libya, a kind of a need for an intervention to help them to avoid the conflict. There may have been some issues in Zambia here and there, some labor market tensions. I don't recall anything close to this type of incident ever.
Could I add one incident that occurred in CAR with Chinese? Because I just wanted to note in 2018, 3 Chinese miners were killed in the Central African Republic. It was a result of very often when Chinese mining companies don't uphold their end of the bargain on ecological issues or what they promise. There's been communities have responded, and in this instance, 3 were.
It was a local dispute between locals and the miners.
Exactly, and 3 miners were killed in that incident, and it made it a little bit of in a few articles, I think, in Chinese media, but ultimately, as we kind of describe the nature of outside of Bangui and the lack of kind of central state control, we didn't see much of a response from the Chinese government at that time. This is still, like we were saying, a very different episode, and one that I think is going to resonate much more.
Well, I've been reading the Chinese news in the last few hours preparing, and this story has definitely made the Chinese news in Chinese characters. It's made the Taiwanese news in Chinese characters, and Singapore also. And very clear and explicitly, there have been articles saying this is the Central African Republic, this is the basics of the relationship, this is the times when, there's been relations with Taiwan or Beijing. And so I think this is, this has happened just after, Xi has his 3rd term, he's been to Moscow, and there's been this peace deal. This year is the 10th anniversary of the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative. One thing I did find interesting in the Chinese press was the emphasis that it was a privately funded Chinese project. So there was definitely emphasis that this was not and had not happened in a state-owned enterprise project. So it was very clearly stated, okay, there's been an attack on workers in a Chinese funded private
Professor
enterprise.
Johnston, let's, in trying to understand the mindset of the Chinese press, were there any analysis or editorial? It was just strictly, okay, this is what happened, there you have the details. Was there any analysis in future and what sort of response the Chinese government should give, or it was just plain reported?
It was very factual, at least what I found.
Yes.
There may have been some chats deeper in Chinese media that took me a while. I didn't find. Certainly the main media focused on communicating what is the relationship between China and Central African Republic. and the number of deaths that the Chinese ambassador had responded, and that it was a vicious attack and, severe. But I didn't see any particular details. Possibly also I wasn't looking as much for those, also because I'm not a Central African Republic expert. So I was looking more for the macro story. But as we've acknowledged, the details of who is responsible are not yet known.
Still.
And
Yes.
that is explicitly clear because there's no details are provided. There's no speculation. I found not one piece of speculation. It was just facts.
Thank you, Professor Johnston. A fine place to go on a break. We'll go on a quick break, and when we return, we'll continue our conversation on the attack and the death of 9 Chinese mine workers in the Central African Republic. Do stay with us. This is Secure the Continent, New Central Television. Thank you for staying with us. If you're just joining, this is Secure the Continent, and we've been discussing the Chinese nationals' death in the Central African Republic. And we still have with us here John Lechner, freelance journalist and researcher and expert on the Central African Republic, and also Professor Lawrence Johnston, senior researcher of China and Africa, and also for the South African Institute of International Affairs. You're welcome back. Now, John, Russia has become Central African Republic's preferred ally in its battle against insurgents. How effective has the Wagner Group been in dealing with the insurgency in the Central African Republic? And how has the impact of the war in Ukraine affected Wagner's ability to operate in the CAR?
It's a complicated question and I think a lot of it depends on how one measures success. If we're looking at success vis-a-vis the armed groups,
and the way things were before Russian involvement in Central African Republic.
Sure.
Yes.
So we can say before Russian private military company intervention, Bangui controlled very little territory outside of the capital. Following the counteroffensives against the CPC in 2021, we've seen the government retake control of a large amount of territory. Many of the towns that were outside of government control and controlled by the armed groups are back in government hands with a Central African Armed Force contingent there. That said, the roads in between a lot of these towns are still not secure, and there still remain areas, especially in the northeast, up in the border with Chad and Sudan, as well as the southeast along the border with Congo and South Sudan, that remain outside of government control. But if we compare it to their intervention, prior to their intervention, they have succeeded in reestablishing control over a large number of towns. That being said, of course, they do stand accused of abuses at the same time with that regaining of territorial control.
What about the United Nations mission in the Central African Republic? How effective has it been, and what's its mandate?
Sure. The UN peacekeeping mission MINUSCA has a very robust mandate. They are able to pursue armed group members, not just defend, but actually kind of go after these individuals. But that being said, I think a lot of Central African citizens have been disappointed with the UN peacekeeping mission. There have been certainly plenty of instances where certain contingents of MINUSCA peacekeepers have stayed on base when there's been an armed group attack. And in general, I would say that a lot of distrust exists between citizens and MINUSCA. Some of those are an issue of the structural issues of UN peacekeeping. but also issues that pertain specifically to the MINUSCA task force in terms of, I would say, bureaucratic and kind of slow operating and slow responses to issues.
Not quite effective, almost similar to the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo with MINUSCA. Now, Professor Johnston, looking at the way the world has operated in the last 60 years and from colonization to independent states, the nature of business between Africa and its former colony is almost that of paternalistic too, but things are changing, and when you have business interests, you also have sort of military overtures to protect that business interest. And I'm talking about France in this case. If you look at uranium mining in the Niger Republic, it's very important to the national security of France. Therefore, they have a military base in Niger. They have a military cooperation agreements with this state. And we've seen the Belt and Road Initiative of China growing. What model would they pursue in protecting its business interests and investments in these places, all the way from Kazakhstan to Africa, in its Belt and Road Initiative?
Gosh, that's a big question. As we said before, China does have its base already in Djibouti, which can allow it at least to intervene in a sense of rescuing civilians, like it did, as best it did in the case of Libya. Since I have followed China Africa, which is not from a security perspective, yes, there have been talks that China is looking for a base in Namibia, looking for a base in the Seychelles, Comoros, that they're constantly looking for another base from which they can have that type of base from which to respond. That obviously doesn't strictly answer the day-to-day security issues. So how are they doing that? How are they? I mean, I guess in the first instance, they're letting their civilians, their investors know the level of risk when they go in the first place. So, they had issued warnings already to Chinese on March 13 to take a lot of care. Mm-hmm. If you already have a gold mine, that's very difficult to suddenly take care. Are they prepared to start being involved in having mercenaries? Are they prepared to? I'm not an expert on those topics. They are definitely investing a lot in their navy and in their military, in their technology. Maybe some of their AI capacities and their satellite capacities will be able to predict some of these incidences before they happen.
But you don't see an overt military type intervention and presence in Africa like other Western powers have done in the past to secure their business interest?
I don't see it in the same way. Like, obviously, France has a very unique relationship with Francophone West Africa. China doesn't have the same depth of ties, of linguistic ties, of cultural ties, even of immigration ties. Like, a lot of those West African countries where there are French military, there are hundreds of thousands of citizens of those countries who are now citizens of France, and even geographically they're closer. So the depth of ties between the countries is not the same, and therefore the relationship between even Chinese military personnel and locals would be different, because even their communication would be harder. So it doesn't mean China won't, but it would be hard to replicate that model. Obviously, they will want to protect their interests. Will they have innovative ways of doing that are different? Will they, go for historic ways? Time will tell. When I started, back in 2004-5, I was working in a Chinese government built building in Freetown. At that point, there was talk of, even back then, of China wanting access to the harbor in Freetown.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think a Chinese military ship has stopped there since, like a big one. But at that stage, no one would have foreseen this military base in Djibouti. So I wouldn't rule anything out, but I think it would be very hard to be like the French model for those reasons stated.
I think I agree with you, because times have changed, and but like you said, you never know. I guess we have to wait and see how things evolve.
And also,
yes,
I think one thing is that the Chinese have trained a lot of, maybe they're deepening their training of Chinese military personnel. Like they have a lot of training of engineers and of kind of people-to-people exchanges of army personnel, of navy personnel. I think in Zimbabwe, China has built the National Military University or College. And I don't think Zimbabwe is the only country, but there's several countries where China has literally built the National Military College. They've probably built the Ministry of Defense, ministry buildings, which again is quite different to the old model and might provide for a different type of protection, a different type of intervention, a different type of foresight. And compared to the colonial period, there's so much more technology even. There's satellite technology that can track things. There's live time, social media. So even that side makes it hard. But obviously China does want to protect its interests. So let's watch and see how they do that.
Okay, thank you, Professor Johnston. Now, John, as we begin to wrap up the conversation, still talking Central African Republic, what measures can be taken to improve security and stability in the Central African Republic? What role can foreign governments, the international community and organizations play in achieving this? And my last question to you, we talked about the United Nations involvement in Central African Republic, and you didn't have quite a lot of hope in it. So what's the way forward for the country, for all of the Central African Republic to achieve relative stability and security like the capital, Bangui?
If I could answer that question, then I probably wouldn't be sitting here right now. I'd be somewhere else in a fancy office. But I would say what Russian PMCs are not usually the cause of the issues in the countries where they operate. They're a symptom of the issues that already existed, and that's the same true with any private military company, any group of mercenaries. I think that ultimately what we're going to have to see in CAR is a mixture and a remarkable amount of good timing to see both some sort of peace agreement with the armed groups that are willing to actually lay down arms, and a military solution with those who do not. And there are a lot of citizens in CAR who do not just want another peace deal that sees the most violent actors at the table back in the government. At the same time, you're going to have some younger people in the country actually in positions of power who are both coming from the inside but actually able to reform a part of the system so that we actually see a better distribution of resources from Bangui to the countryside and see a certain level of better distribution and more equitable relationships overall between the political class and its citizens. So it's very tough. The country finds itself in a security dilemma right now, and we'll need a lot of things to go right at the same time to see ourselves out of this.
Thank you, John. And finally, Professor Johnston, how might this attack on Chinese workers affect the broader relationship between China and Africa? And what implications might it have for China's Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, in terms of China-Africa, it certainly might make some of China's more risk-taking workers a little more risk-averse. It might also make them demand a much higher salary to go to such risky countries. So it might be a lot of wage inflation. It might even lead towards a deepening of the security, the kind of micro-security architecture around these investments. So what there is already of Chinese private security type firms in Africa, they will probably get more business. In June, there will be the third China-Africa Economic and Trade Exhibition, which, you know, what's well known in China-Africa studies and policy is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, which began in 2001. At FOCAC in 2018, Xi Jinping called for an economic and trade exhibition. And the first one was held in 2019, but it was brand new, wasn't well known. And it was held in Changsha in Hunan province, which is a landlocked province in kind of central South China. And it's the home of Mao Zedong. It's like the food bowl of China. The third of these and the first post-COVID will be held in June in Changsha again. I expect this to be a much bigger trade forum than the first one because it's the third one.
Yes.
But a much bigger one than the second because the second was held during COVID. And so obviously it was online. And this is now Xi Jinping's third term. There's all this global push. There's all this global friction. So I'm predicting that this will be a much bigger event. And probably the Central African Republic has never had a big role to play, but perhaps its indirect impact on this China-Africa Economic Trade Exhibition will be significant. Perhaps maybe there'll be more exhibitions for security. There'll be more emphasis.
I'm sure it's a conversation that would definitely take place. I'm afraid we're out of time. I'd like to say a big thank you to you, Professor Lauren Johnston, and also John Lechner. You've been a great company. I do appreciate your time and insight and also your contribution to the program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.